And it's a great honour to be giving the first Sir Jack Goody lecture here. I was wondering why I couldn't see the script. It's one of those nightmares you have when suddenly you've gone blind, but it's my glasses. Some people have influenced me through the force of their ideas, some through the force of their personality. The distinguished Cambridge anthropologist, Professor Sir Jack Goody, has combined these. He has undoubtedly been the strongest influence on my career as an anthropologist, and to a certain extent, as a historian. I'm told I can talk to you for about an hour, so I'm going to not go beyond that. And I hope you'll have a chance to have some questions or talk to me afterwards if you'd like to. I first came across Jack's work during my MPhil at the London School of Economics in 1967. He was appointed as my MPhil examiner, which was when I met him. And I next met him in Cambridge, where he became the William Wise Professor of Anthropology in 1973, just after I arrived there. I remember that he was friendly and encouraging in various ways. Most importantly, when I applied for my first teaching job in 1974 in the Department of Social Anthropology, to the post until lately held by his wife Esther, he not only encouraged me to apply, but really backed me, because the first appointment in a department in England is usually given to the professor. If any of you know about the jus primae noctis custom, something similar to that. I won't go into it now, but ask your friends what that is. Anyway, I was his first appointment. I remember going into the room, and Sir Edmund Leach, who was there and rather outspoken, before I'd opened my mouth, he just turned to the committee and said, well, I suppose it's his job to give away. This man can have it if he wants. And so I knew I was more or less likely to get it. Anyway, in fact, for the rest of the tenure of his 10 years professor to 1983, he was always a wonderful patron and support. He encouraged me in every possible way, and it's difficult to measure his influence on me. Intellectually, his work and conversations with him had an enormously enlivening effect. If any of you went to his talk a couple of years ago, although he was very ill, 93 then, he was always interested in everything. If he came to Malta, he would be noticing things and asking questions all the time. Part of his breadth of vision arose from the fact that he was of an interdisciplinary background. He had read English as an undergraduate, but fortunately for me, a particular interest he had was in history and its relationship to anthropology. So we discussed themes and overlaps, in particular in relation to the history of European kinship and marriage, about which we were both writing in those years. Much of his work was set in a long historical time frame, often covering thousands of years. He was practicing, in fact, an early form of what is now called global history, and maintaining the honourable tradition in anthropology of Kroeber and others in looking at long sweeps of civilization. Another stimulation was Jack's interest in technology and material life. Not only was he interested in the practicalities of computers and machines, but he again maintained an earlier and somewhat unfashionable anthropological tradition in being interested in material technologies. Thus he wrote books and articles exploring technologies of production, destruction, and communication and their effects. This was all the more suggestive because it was broadly comparative, always coming back to the basic contrast which informed his work. That is the difference between the post-Neolithic civilizations of Eurasia and the pre-Neolithic civilizations and technologies of sub-Saharan Africa, where he'd done his early fieldwork. It's on this theme, where he has published half a dozen or more books, the East and the West and so on, that I would like to devote my lecture. in tribute to a great historical anthropologist. The first divergence, from mythical to axial. For 95% of human history, it was only possible to communicate by sound and gesture through human speech, song, facial and bodily expressions. This set severe limitations on the power and flexibility of knowledge. The discovery of writing systems thus constituted the first great transformation. Writing is in many ways much more powerful than speaking. As Jack Goody has argued in The Logic of Writing, writing eliminates the need for both the speaker and listener to be in the same place at the same time. A person can now read at his or her own convenience in time and space, and can take up or lay down the text, reread and compare, and make amendments. The power of writing, as Jacques pointed out, made world religions possible. Religious truths could be written down so that what we have now known as religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, could be developed, and also religions based on written texts such as Hinduism and Buddhism. There is now a written and definitive version of the standard truths. There is a universal and uniform message from God, or the gods. There is a literate priesthood to interpret these truths. There are increasingly firm boundaries between good and evil with capital letters. Religion is religion with a capital R, and is a byproduct of writing. Likewise, the economy, as he showed, is based on writing. Accounting, money, credit, taxation, rents, private property, exchange, all of these are virtually impossible to develop without some ways of storing and transmitting information outside the individual human mind. The huge trading networks and complex bureaucracies of the early civilizations could not have developed without writing. Likewise, the presence of writing inaugurated the state. Leaders could now control space and time in a new way and turn tribesmen into subjects. State officials and state organizations all require writing. The development of law as a separate sphere was made possible by writing. There were now legal codes and written precedents. Judges and lawyers emerged to interpret and adjudicate. People could leave property through written wills. Contracts could be made and witnessed. Written evidence presented in court. Indeed, there arose a new concept of an external truth, existing outside the biased opinions of individuals and universally applicable in all situations. Pictographic writing had been discovered in most of Eurasia very early on, but its effects were increased when the Greeks perfected alphabetic writing about 3,000 years ago. No longer did writing take the form of little pictures of reality, but became an incredibly powerful symbolic tool. With writing, humans could pursue truth and transmit their emotions in an efficient and cumulative way. What I've just told you now may seem pretty self-evident and obvious, and you may say, oh well, I knew that all the time. But before Jack Goody's work, a lot of this wasn't really brought to our attention. I remember reading his books and really being shocked at the power of what he had discovered. This takes the story of philosophical systems across Eurasia up to about 800 BC. In the following half millennium, between 800 and 300 BC, partly through the influence of writing, a second great transformation took place. This is something which may be new to some of you. I may have actually asked, just out of interest, how many of you have ever heard of Carl Jaspers and the theory of the Axial Age? All the people in the front row. Anyone else in the next part of it? Or something new maybe. The second transformation, following the work of Karl Jaspers, who was one of the great polymaths of the 20th century, the only man who was really Max Weber's equal in width of knowledge, except he spoke all the languages of the culture of the civilizations of China, India, Middle East, and Europe, which Weber studied but didn't speak the original languages of. Previously, the natural and the supernatural worlds were entangled with each other up to about 800 BC, not seen in opposition or contradiction. In most tribal religions, the world of spirit was largely a reflection of this world and intertwined and blended with it. Humans and animals, this life and the afterlife, were all on one level. This is often a world of shamanism and witchcraft, of animism, material things having spirit in them, and of attempts to put pressure upon spirits through sacrifice and magical spells. The divine world is not a separate ideal order against which we measure this life, but a continuation of the sensory world in an invisible form. Even in the great literate civilizations of Eurasia, thought was embedded, and there was no strong distinction between this world and an ideal and separate one. And then, for reasons as yet largely unexplained, in much of Europe and Asia, over a period of 600 years, a number of great religious and philosophical figures changed all this. You're interested in this after a lifetime of studying all these world religions and writing many books about them. Karl Jaspers summarized it all, and this part of it in one chapter of a small book called The Origins and Build of History, which is one of the most important books you could ever read. Anyway, in this 600 years, something new was born. There was a new philosophical system where a dynamic tension was created between this world of matter and another world of spirit. They set up, these people, the ideals against which our behavior should be judged. New philosophical systems provided a reorganized relation between a god or an ideal system and this corrupted world. Simultaneously, in China, this happened in the works of Lao Tse and Confucius. In India, in the Upanishads and the teachings of the Buddha. In Iran, with Zoroaster. In the Middle East, in the books of the great Old Testament prophets, including Elijah, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. In Greece, in the fount of Western thought, in Homer, Heraclitus, Plato, and others. So China found its Confucian template, by which it has lived for 2,000 years. Much of India and Central Asia, its Hindu and Buddhist salvation. And the western end of the continent, the firm foundations for the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which were to dominate that world combined with Greek philosophy. The value of what these thinkers established is enormous, and still influences all of us today. We live in that world to a large extent, though we have rejected much of the larger framework. Many of our basic categories in logic, political thought, ideal types of knowledge were laid down in this period, and in many senses we in the West are the heirs of the Greek, Arabic and medieval Western thought and the great philosophers and religious figures of India and China. This change is axial. The metaphor he used was of a wheel turning on its axis. This is why it's called the Axial Age. The whole world turned on its axis. It's axial in another sense, in that philosophical systems developed in this period are still at the centre or axis of our present systems of thought. Like spokes from a central hub or axis, all later thought systems in the world have radiated outwards from that great transformative revolution, lasting only half a millennium. It was a worldview which did not immediately vanish at the Renaissance. For many of the thinkers of the period, as the very word Renaissance, rebirth, implies, thought of a return to an earlier period of superior knowledge. Yet there was something different, a sense of advance and change, which is well captured, for example, in the work of the English philosopher Francis Bacon, in his various works on how experimental science could change our world, and how we could know new things, and have technologies which separate us from the ancients. So something was happening then. This change, this second axial age, which is how Jaspers looks at it in his book, there's another chapter on this second axial revolution is different from the first. The first encompassed the whole of Eurasia. The second only affected half of Eurasia, or less than half, the western end. And it would separate the two ends of Eurasia, the west and the east, for the next 300 years. It is the basis for much of our world now, and I want to now talk about that second axial age, the second divergence, if you like to use that phrase, which is now commonly used, from pre-scientific to the age, as Jaspers calls it, the age of science and technology. It's widely agreed that the progress of the scientific and technological age is an exclusively European phenomenon for several hundred years. That this is so has been suggested by many historians who have studied the traditions of Europe, the Middle East, China, and Japan. The realization that something unusual had happened in the West, but not in the East, is forcefully demonstrated in the first systematic book on Chinese civilization, written by a Western scholar, that is Père P.J.B. du Halde's great book, written in the first half of the 18th century, called The Description of the Empire of China, published in 1735, and based on the Jesuit reports of what they were doing in China. It already shows an awareness that something special, a scientific breakthrough, had occurred in Europe, which was absent in China. So I would like to just quote you Du Halde. When we cast our eyes on the great number of libraries in China, magnificently built, suitably adorned, and enriched with prodigious collections of books, when we consider the surprising multitude of their doctors and of the colleges established in all the cities of the empire, their observations, and with what attention they inspect the heavens, that for about 4,000 years, according to the laws of the empire, the literati only have been governors of cities and provinces, and have possessed all the offices of the tribunals and about the court, one would be apt to believe that of all nations in the world, the Chinese must be the most ingenious and learned. However, a small acquaintance with them will quickly undeceive one. It is true we must acknowledge that the Chinese have a great deal of wit, but then is it an inventive, searching, profound wit? They have made discoveries in all the sciences, but have not brought to perfection any of those we call speculative, and which require subtlety and penetration. Nevertheless, I will not pretend to find fault with their capacity, much less will I affirm they want talents, and their sagacity, and that sagacity proper for going to the bottom of things. since it is very plain that they succeed in other things which require as much genius and penetration as the speculative sciences. So he was fully aware of their abilities, but somehow something was missing. And he then, in several chapters, examines Chinese knowledge of the sciences, mathematics, chemistry, and so on. And he describes how rhetoric, logic, and geometry was hardly developed at all. It was only in astronomy, to which he devotes 10 pages, was there real progress from a Western point of view. Now, that was a long time ago. Moving on to Cambridge in the 1950s, 60s. A great scientist, biologist, Sir Joseph Needham, in the second half of his life, devoted his huge abilities and energies to the study of Chinese science and civilization, as some of you may know. He personally translated and edited a number of the volumes, and it has continued. It is one of the great works of human knowledge. And he did this partly, he'd been in China, to solve what he considered to be one of the great enigmas of history, now widely known as the Needham question. And that is the divergence in knowledge systems. Why was it that China was the greatest of all civilizations in terms of knowledge by the 13th, 14th century, and then nothing much else happened for half a millennium? He frequently noticed the divergence, I quote, but then after the scientific renaissance had begun in the West, with the Galilean revolution, with what one might almost call the discovery of the basic technique of scientific discovery itself, then the curve of science and technology in Europe begins to rise in a violent, almost exponential manner, overtaking the levels of the Asian societies. In the introduction to a book summarizing many of his thoughts, suitably called The Grand Titration, in 1969, he wrote, "Why then did modern science, as opposed to ancient and medieval science, with all that modern science implies in terms of political dominance, develop only in the Western world?" In the 1985 introduction to The Genius of China by Robert Temple, which was a popular summary of much of Needham's work, Needham wrote in the preface, "If the Chinese were so advanced in antiquity and the Middle Ages, how was it that the scientific revolution, the coming of modern science, happened only in Europe? It may be remembered that it was precisely this problem which presented itself to me so forcefully when I first met the Chinese scientists who came to Cambridge in 1937. What happened as a result of the inauguration of the Age of Science and Technology was a profound shift whose implications we are now only fully experiencing, and I'll talk about towards the end of the lecture. Basically, it is the faster and faster cycling round a triangle of discovery, invention, multiplication of artifacts, and then feeding back into further inventions. This I owe to the work of my friend Jerry Martin. So we not only have more knowledge growing through the experimental method at an exponential rate, but that knowledge is then embedded in new technologies, which then increases new knowledge. Whereas technologies and reliable knowledge have grown in various parts of the world for many centuries, the rate had tended to be linear. That is a line like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, like this, slowly changing as a result of a sort of Darwinian selection, random variation, and selective retention of what was best. Chance, in fact. What the changes in methodology and spirit described by Jaspers did in parts of Europe was to lead to a systematic speeding up of the process, so that it proceeded at an ever-increasing rate. The process became exponential, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, like this. The difference of linear and exponential growth is shown in a diagram I'll show you in a moment. And I'll give you two diagrams from Needham's work. The first is where he's talking about, in general, about Western and Eastern sciences, and it comes from figure 99 in the grand titration. And it's been somewhat simplified in the handwriting of my, in the drawing of my granddaughter, Lily. So, if you can read Lily's drawing, an important simple fact is the Chinese had invented these important things earlier, as everyone knows, than the West. Mariner's compass, gunpowder and printing, well before the West was discovering these. But Chinese science and technology went, this is Needham's diagram, went like this. It's linear, it's growing very slowly. By 1950, it's just growing a bit here. And now, of course, it's going like this. Western knowledge in science is also growing in a sort of linear way, but faster. This is about 1300 here, growing. According to this diagram, it intersects, in general, around 1600, 1650, around the time of Bacon. And if you look at different sciences, medicine, chemistry, and so on, and botany, what you've got here are exponential curves, as you see. They intersect with China a bit later in a number of cases, but they go up like this. And so it's entirely different. And this is the effect of scientific, systematic, trial and error experimental method. So that's one diagram which Needham put forward. So you can see for a very long time, until about the 15th, 16th century, China was way ahead of the West in knowledge and technology. And then it changed. If this is roughly accurate, then the exponential rate of change in most of the Western sciences starts about between 1450 and 1750, in mathematics, astronomy, physics, botany, medicine and chemistry, in that order. There's first an increase in theoretical knowledge and understanding of the basic laws of nature. This has increased at an exponential rate, and then it goes round the triangle, as I mentioned. He gives a number of examples, and one of them that interests me is the history of the clock, which has been well studied. And you can see from his diagram about clockwork the following. This is Chinese knowledge of the clock. The great Susum clock just before 1100, which seems to be almost possibly an escapement clock of a very modern kind, which was made, and then within 50 years it's been dismantled and all the bits have been lost. But Chinese knowledge of keeping time was well ahead. This is European, starting here, the escapement around here, and very low. Then what happens? The Chinese goes on in this linear way, and in the West you get these, the first pendulum clock, improved escapements, temperature compensation, and so on and so on. And you can see this is an exponential up to the atomic clock here, an exponential growth of efficiency of clockwork and timekeeping. And that's just one of many examples you could take of the difference caused by a scientific revolution. The effects of this are not just on science. The effects are on all aspects of life, and I want to give you another couple of examples. One is in economics. You won't be able to read this in detail, but basically this timeline here is about 1200 here, 1300 maybe. This is about 1900 here, and the bottom thing is the size of the Chinese economy, Chinese GDP, and this is the size of Western economy. Comparative levels of GDP per capita, it's not the size, it's the levels of GDP per capita, China and Western Europe, 400 to 2000. Now what you see here is that up to about 1200, China is per capita GDP wealthier. From about 1200, you begin to get a linear growth of Western economies. It's not exponential, it's linear, but it's quite steep. And China goes into what my friend Mark Elvin calls the high-level equilibrium trap. It's an S curve, goes up and then levels out. This is the effect of the disasters of the 20th century and late 19th century, Boxer Rebellion and so on. And then Chairman Mao is this. And then about 1820, this is around 1820, there's the effects of the Industrial Revolution is to make Western economic growth change from linear to exponential, and from about, we can date it precisely to 1982, Deng Xiaoping, or the 1980s, Chinese economic growth is going like this. If you could actually see it, this is a sharper exponential growth than this one. This is why they are overtaking Western economies so fast. This figure is from Madison, Angus Madison. Some of you may know him. He was the greatest historical statistician. Died sadly. He worked for the UN, and his work is based on a huge amount of research and is usually considered to be pretty sound. You could challenge it, but that's the closest estimate we have to what happened. The effects are enormous, and one of them, which will be obvious to you, is that if a Western country had tried to attack China in 1700, it would have been completely flattened by the Chinese armies and so on. The technologies and wealth and so on were roughly equal. By the 1850s, the British in the First and Second Opium Wars were able, with very small gunboats and troops, to destroy the Chinese Empire effectively. So, and the growth of the British Empire is largely the result of this growth of science, technology, obviously. Such a small island, to have conquered such a large island as Malta, or taken it over, required cutting-edge technology. Another effect was a mental and moral effect, which is the growth of the idea of progress. I won't go into the Enlightenment and so on, but the whole optimism and leading up to the French Revolution, American Declaration of Independence, and our modern thoughts on progress and so on, arise out of a situation where people would be born within one set of technologies and one level of income, and within their life new things would happen, and they would discover the world was becoming around them richer and more technologically sophisticated. Another effect of this, which I'll just very briefly mention since it's very important, was the growth of world populations. When Malthus was writing his famous Principles of Population in the end of the 18th century, he was writing around here, just that sudden leap that goes up starts in the middle of the 18th century, and you can see the exponential growth. At the time of Malthus and Gibbon, the world had roughly 500 million people, and as you know now, it has many, many times that. And that wouldn't have been possible. I mean, Adam Smith and other thinkers believed that we had reached the limits of the resources of the world. You couldn't feed more than 500 million people on this planet, and with the technologies of that time, that was probably roughly right. So the rest of it, the other billions, have been as a result of the scientific evolution. I now want to turn to the idea of accelerating change. And this has interested me recently because I didn't know much about the effects of technology on changing our world so fast. What I want to establish are two things. One is that the speed and dimensions of change are ever greater. I never really understood the ideas of exponential, or even what is now called the exponential within the exponential. In other words, the exponential change occurs faster and faster. Just to give you an off-the-cuff example, when a computer scientist called Moore in the 1960s developed his idea that the speed of computing, or the cost of computers, or power of computers, would double every 18 months, when Moore first formulated as head of Intel his law about transistors. It was every 18 months. Within about 10 years, it was re-revised to every 15 months, which is what Moore's law is usually thought to be. Currently, it's about every 9 months. So computers become twice as powerful in 9 months now. And everything else. I went onto the internet recently looking for a digital camera, and I typed in digital camera, and I got up these things which said digital camera and case £30. And I thought, well, why are they showing me the cases for digital cameras? And they were showing me the digital cameras, which cost £17, and the case as well. I mean, these were cameras which would have cost £2,000 3 years ago, or more. So, exponential within the exponential. Let's look at it first in terms of economic growth. The International Monetary Fund, and I'll take the case of China, estimates that the Chinese gross domestic product, this is people's, it only takes it up, as you can see, till about 2005. They estimate that the domestic GDP per head has increased fourfold between 1978 and 2001. In the next 10 years, it increased a further sixfold. And this is, so over this period, in the second period, the GDP was growing at a rate of between 8 and 12% per annum in a population of 1.2 billion people. The implications of this, I mean, it's slowed down a bit now, as you know, but the implications of what is, as you can see, an exponential, just going faster and faster, is that even if you have a lowering growth, I haven't really thought of this, but basically if you have 12% on an economy of a certain size, if it then slows to 8%, but the economy has quadrupled in size, you're still getting a huge and faster growth. If current projections are right, China and the United States will be roughly level in total GDP between 2016 and 2020. Now that's not usually known, and it may not be true because of fracking, which suddenly has revived the American economy, but and the Chinese has slowed down a bit, but until very recently it looked as if China would overtake America in its GDP by 2016, which is 2 years' time. I don't think it'll be 2 years, it may be 10 years, but it'll be quite soon. And in those older estimates, by 2035, the Chinese GDP will be twice that of America. That's a thought. Maybe 2040. It may not happen because economists are hopeless at predicting anything, as you know. But that's the, if you take the trends up till now, that's how it is. One of the effects, echoing early discussions, is again a very surprising diagram I came across when I was writing this, is the change in the relations between the centre of gravity. I was sent this by an American colleague of mine who I was interested in. The centre of economic gravity on this planet, put on a map, and I don't know if any of you have seen this, but I find it fascinating. You look here, AD 1, the centre of gravity was down here. I mean, China was so wealthy and India was wealthy. Then you can follow this up, 1820, 1913, 1940, and at its peak, just around after the Second World War, in the 1960s, it almost reached America. And then it started to come back, slowly at first, 1990, 2000. This is plotted in 2 dimensions. It's both upwards and downwards, so it's gradually being dragged down by India and China. And the effect of the dragging down is that 2000 it's there, 2010 it's there, and supposedly by 2025 it's again pretty close to China and coming south. So it's moving south and moving east very fast. And who knows what it'll be in 2030 or whatever. It's a very, very dramatic swing, and all of us feel it all the time. We feel it in Cambridge every day. I mean, last year there were 300,000 Chinese tourists. This year there'll be 1 million Chinese tourists. Next year there'll be 2 million Chinese tourists, and so on. Because they're wealthy, all these school kids and so on can come to China, to Cambridge, because it's now a wealthy country. And you can see the same thing in population growth. This has also surprised me, because if you look at this is the growth of Chinese population. And perhaps one surprising thing is that it continued to grow, and there are blips here at the turn of the century. But what is really surprising in some ways is all of us have heard of the one-child policy. But although it's had quite a considerable effect, it hasn't stopped Chinese population growth. This is around the time of the introduction of the one-child policy. And because of the momentum of population, it's still growing pretty fast. And it's actually, this is out of date now, it's now 1.36 billion. And still growing fast enough to make a Malta every day and an England every week or month at least. Another major change which has interested me and I mentioned is in communications technology. Because of the invention of the method of invention, the speed and cost of everything technical is coming down very, very fast, and this has had obvious effects on all of us in relation to travel by car, rail, plane, which means that huge numbers of people are now on the move. Another is in the acceleration and quality of television with satellite services and so on. The third is in the revolution in telephones, with mobile phones and satellites, which you are all moving through, and the younger ones of you won't have lived in the revolution that caused this. You are no doubt aware of how much is changing, but you won't have had the good fortune of living in a house, as I did with my wife, without a telephone of any kind for many years, and having to go down to one of those red call boxes, which I'm delighted to see you have in Malta, telephone boxes, and making your calls there. All of these changes are connected to the digital or electronic revolution, which has obviously not only affected the cost and availability of computers, but made us into a kind of digital world. The law behind this is, as I mentioned, Moore's law, and it's a particular application of that triangle of knowledge that I mentioned to you. Moore's law, you have better transistors, you think of new ways of working out conceptually models and programming languages and so on, feeds into particular artifacts which are then multiplied, which then give you better thinking machines, which you then put back into new ideas. And the effect of this is quite extraordinary. I remember, for instance, when I visited with my wife the Apple shop, which had just opened, the Apple Mac shop, which had just opened in central Beijing in 2009, and witnessing the crowds of young people rushing into the Apple shop to buy whatever the current Apple Mac or iPod or iPad was of that time. And seeing things in that shop which I hadn't seen in Cambridge when I'd left it a few weeks before. And going through this revolution, because I came into a world where, for instance, a computer in Cambridge, which was I worked with first, and your rector probably had heard of it even if he's younger than me, which was the IBM 360-165. And that took up basically this room. It took up the whole floor of the Cambridge laboratory, computing laboratory, and his boss, Roger Neelan, was director of this. So you had a room this size. And when we tried to put the data of our project onto this, we were told it was too big to fit on. They would have to invent double density disk packs. So we waited a bit and we were able to put it on, and we were enormously excited, and they showed us the huge, great magnetic tapes on which our data held. Now, if any of you know how to measure size of data on computers, you will perhaps be surprised that our total data was 38 megabytes. And your mobile phone now is more powerful than the IBM 370-165 that we had at that time. There are devices smaller than this, which were far more powerful, far bigger storage, for example, and processing speeds than, and this is only 45 years ago, or so. And it's quite scary. The next diagram I show you, you mustn't think about too much if you're of a nervous disposition. Because this is a futurologist. Have any of you heard of the Singularity? Sounds like a science fiction sort of thing. Well, the Singularity is when computers become more intelligent than human beings. In every sense of intelligence, not just processing power, but memory, intuition, all the different aspects that a human brain can do. Now, if you ask people when the singularity is going to be, they say, God forbid, don't tell me. But anyway, I'm going to tell you. If you can see this, this is another very good example of an exponential growth of computing. 1900 is almost nothing. 1960, you see we're back here, which is when I started about 1973, 74, around here. And this is what it's doing. It's a logarithmic scale. And if you take an insect brain, computers were as powerful in terms of computational power as an insect brain around the millennium, 2000. If you move to quite an intelligent mammal, I don't want to say anything bad about mice, intelligent mammal, one mouse brain, about 2000 and, well, around now, yeah, roughly. So a computer is about as powerful as a mouse. One human brain, about 2025. And all human brains, 2050. All the human brains on the planet in one computer. And because of the exponential here, the power of computing as it goes up will mean that the power of computers will be moving out at the speed of light by the end of this century, if you could measure them in light terms. This, I mean, the obvious implication is that none of us are going to have to do any professional jobs, because computers will be able to do anything that requires human brain power. So getting to your job very quickly now, because soon it won't be necessary to hire you at all. Of course, we'll think of ways of going around it, but anyway. And the effect on all of you is well illustrated with another diagram I came across, which I thought was very interesting. This is the internet growth, usage phases, technical events. And this is the social web, going up exponentially. It's only going here to 2012, so we're beyond that. This is Facebook, for example. This is hosts for computer sites. And the extraordinary thing is how quickly, I mean, in the year 2000, or even 2002, when I started my first website and so on, there was almost nothing. This is Google here, Wi-Fi introduced around 2000, broadband introduced about 2001, and things like Facebook here, 2004, Firefox, Twitter up here, everything, YouTube is around here and so on. All this is really in the last 10 years, even in the last 2 years. All sorts of things have happened, which I can tell you about if you want to be ahead of the game privately afterwards. But anyway, it's all amazing, amazing what is happening. So you have to plan for a world in which every school in the world will have access to all libraries, all books, all films, whether they're in the remotest parts of Africa or Pakistan or anywhere, where everyone will have devices, if they want them, on them, which will give them access to more or less any information they need. Where you will, I hope, have a little device in your ear, as in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which can translate between languages, so you can go to any country and people can talk in their language and you can hear them in your own language. That's not far off. Always you think it's impossible. When I talk to computer scientists in Cambridge in the 1970s, 80s, and about natural language translations and so on, they said, oh no, I don't think you can be able to do that. And then 3 years later they said, well actually, you can do that now. So, what about our present condition? And here I will draw towards the end. Much of this talk has been a summary of Carl Jasper's work, though he died in the 60s, so he predicted our world. He said it would be a world run on the basis of technology and even computers he foresaw, but he wasn't here to live and see it. But he did give us a map. Out of all his great erudition, he synthesized into that book, The Origin and Goal of History, and then into a chapter, and then into a diagram, world history, as he saw it, and it seems to me pretty accurate. So I will leave you with this final diagram. We all start together, the one origin of mankind, prehistory, and then you get the great ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus, and the Chinese. And these ancient civilizations go on like this. You get the primitive peoples and the peoples who don't develop written languages here, and they tend to die out. And then you get the Axial Age, as I'll describe, which affects all These: India, China, Byzantium, Islam, the West. But then only one, the West, goes up through this age of science and technology in its original form, and goes up into Europe and America and Russia. And then recently there's been this rush where this age of science and technology has spread everywhere. And the phenomenal growth that you're seeing in India, Africa, China, earlier in Japan, is one consequence. Just to recap briefly, in the West there was the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, and in China this did not occur. There was a growing divergence in economy, society, and polity. Thus, by the middle of the 19th century, Western power was far greater and able to predate on much of the world and set up its world empires. Of course, there were small imports of new technologies and ideas into China, both during the 18th and 19th centuries. But by the end of the 19th century, the East and the West were far apart. One small indication of this was in the centres of learning. Europe had flourishing universities from the 13th century, but though it had all those early academies of which Duhalde spoke, the first modern-style universities in China were only founded from the 1890s. Visitors from China to Japan and the West saw the need to try to catch up, and there was a big effort to do so, with Chinese intellectuals going abroad from the 1890s onwards to America, Japan, and the West. And a great deal was being done by the late 1920s, early 1930s. But it was a huge task to convert an imperial and huge system which had actually not had a scientific revolution into a modern scientific civilization. And any hope of doing so was entirely crushed by what happened in China in the 1930s with the Japanese, the warlord period, the war, and then Chairman Mao. So by the birth of the new China in 1949, China was still basically an axial age civilization. It hardly started on the scientific revolution and had basically missed all the shifts and changes that had occurred in the West from the 16th century onwards. And it hadn't gone through any kind of industrial revolution. At this point it cut itself off from the West and from Japan and became a closed world for 30 years. Marxism is a paradigm or worldview which, while it has an interest in changing history, fixes the present into an unchanging structure of thought, the end point. But once you have a communist society, that is the end. So in 1949 you've achieved it. There's nothing more to be done, really. So in terms of Karl Popper's distinction between the open and the closed society, China was a closed system of thought for the next 30 years. Indeed, with its attack on almost all ideas coming from outside, the distrust of intellectuals and universities, an onslaught on the axial philosophies of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, all alternatives to Marxism were to be eliminated. And what a homogeneous, materialist, and closed mental landscape was created in this period. This was created through the self-fulfilling Marxist prophecy. Thus, in 1979, 1/5 of mankind had not gone through the second axial age. Jaspers identified the age of science and technology. So when Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese were faced with coming to terms with the rest of the world, they not only had to do what we all know they had to do, which was to reconstruct their shattered economy in a world of starvation and inefficiency, which it has done so successfully and is widely described, and coping with that huge population rise which I have mentioned, and a vast urban growth over China. It also had to reshape its educational systems, its family systems, its legal systems, and its government. And it's done all those things in an amazing way which is hardly recognised by the West. in its negative attitudes towards China. But it was also having to go through a philosophical and theoretical revolution, catching up 500 years of rapid development in other parts of the world. And that's why Chinese school children and university students, in a very short time, they have to deal with the whole of Western epistemology and logic and rhetoric and literature and ethics. And they do it. This is why it's not why, but Chinese school children are the best in the world now. And they are facing this. But it's a vast leap. And it's thrown them into a world of confusion and competing systems, which we call postmodernity and postmodernism. But that's for another occasion. Thank you very much.